Thank you very much. I hope you can listen quite well. So there's 11 co-authors in this paper, so I'm very happy to be here on behalf of all of them. I will list them very rapidly. This is a collaboration between KTH, Trinity College, Dublin, and Lancaster University. Axel, Pavel, Charles, and Kia from KTH, Camille and Gavin from Trinity College, Chengcheng, Claudia, Umair, and Corina from Lancaster. What brought us together was a project called Affectech, which is concerned with developing of interactive technologies for treating and managing affective disorders. Affective disorders are estimated to be among the highest ranking cause of disease worldwide by 2020, and these are illnesses that are characterized by perturbations in mood. So, for example, depression is one of the most prevalent ones. As we came together in this project, we sought to understand what is the current research front in HCI. And so the work that I'm presenting here consists on a literature review of 10 years of HCI work in affective disorders. As it's an area that is growing very rapidly, and every year there is a lot of research being published, we sought to create a very tractable and coherent subset of research in this area. And so what we have done practically is we searched for keywords related with the most common affective disorders, these being anxiety, depression, and bipolar disorders in the ACM digital library, and we constrained ourselves to the last 10 years of HCI research from the point that we started doing this study. We have got quite a lot of papers, over almost 3,000 papers that we then constrained to 139 papers that were relevant, addressing actually long-term mental illness. And we have then performed a qualitative thematic analysis that we try to surface things like user groups, what are the main systems functions, if it's a system, developing a system, or if it's a study about requirements and context, and what were the outcomes of deploying the systems, and so on. Our research was informed by 3 main research questions, and then I'm going to now go through each one of them and address them quite broadly. There is much more detail in the paper, obviously. But, so the first research question we asked is, what is the design space of technologies for affective health explored so far in the field of HCI? And with this question, we tried to address if there were different strands of research that we could address, that we could identify, if there was influence and interaction with other fields and disciplines, so psychotherapy, clinical psychology, and so on. And mostly we're trying to identify what were the most promising or underexplored research directions for the future. So broadly speaking, the design space of technologies for affective disorders, we characterize them as there was a major focus on what we call data-driven systems, which have a focus on sensing, processing, and displaying data. And the most common function of the systems, with 24% of the reviewed research, was concerned with diagnosing symptoms related to affective disorders. So predicting manic or depressive episodes and things like that. Mostly making use of passively collected data from mobile phones, such as mobility patterns and so on, but also looking at social media posts and things like that. The second main category, which we call self-tracking, mostly makes use of actively collected data, usually by the users, that track mood, sleep quality, medication, activities, and so on. Self-tracking can be a therapeutic thing in itself that is used for treatment of bipolar disorder, but tracking could also be made for measuring adherence to a particular course of treatment, and so on. Although we use the word self-tracking, tracking often occurs within a constellation of relevant stakeholders, so caregivers, family members, clinical staff, and so on. We've also seen 10% of the research we reviewed was concerned with evaluating how users seek support from others in things like Facebook groups and forums and so on. Slightly less represented, 9% of the reviewed research was concerned with implementing systems that deliver a particular treatment through a series of steps there was high prevalence of a particular type of intervention or therapy called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, whose main aim is to change beliefs about the self and the world towards behavior change. Here we can say that we think there is a space for engaging with other forms of therapy beyond CBT, because CBT, we saw it as almost the only one that was supported by research in HCI. We've also seen research on biofeedback and mindfulness in order to make people aware of what's happening in their bodies whenever there's a panic attack and so on. And this would be research that was aimed at addressing symptoms of affective disorders. And a large chunk of research that was we could not classify into the other of the main categories that was concerned with providing requirements and context. But also we've seen a lot of interesting work here that was concerned with, for example, systems that would apply haptic feedback to calm people during panic attacks, systems to manage proximity with other people in everyday life for people that suffer anxiety, for example, due to autism. Pardon. So what we see here, broadly speaking, that in contrast with data-driven systems, we've seen a lot of work across the other categories that is aimed at providing new types of technology-assisted coping mechanisms that are meant to be embedded in everyday life outside of virtual or online environments. And we think this might be a thriving, possible, promising research area for the future. The second research question is about ethics. So we asked which ethical approaches are followed or developed within the design of these technologies regarding sensitive user groups, particularly since people that suffer from affective disorders can be considered particularly sensitive user groups. So the papers that do mention ethics were mostly concerned with the respect for the voice of people living with affective disorders and would address issues related with consent and privacy that we here mention as autonomy concerns. A second set of ethical concerns were concerned with anticipating risks and minimizing them. So, for example, self-tracking technologies only tracking negative emotional patterns that could backfire and exacerbate negative beliefs and patterns for the future. So a very small subset of research, only 2%, went a step further and did a more informed discussion on balancing benefits against risks and costs. And finally, only 1% addressed how these benefits and costs of developing these technologies would affect people irrespectively of forms of discrimination such as social class, race, and gender. So very few went all the way into what we think would be a very informed ethical discussion. However, the most striking finding is that 2/3 of the reviewed papers do not mention any ethical concerns or values at all, which we thought was a bit disconcerting given the heightened vulnerability of people living with affective disorders. So we looked a bit closer into the papers that do mention ethical concerns, and I'm going to share with you some of the best practices that we think are relevant. There is much more in the paper as well. So the paper, the research that does mention ethical concerns tends to focus on involving users in every stage of the design process. This often makes sure that this involvement makes sure that concerns are surfaced that would otherwise go unnoticed. Involving people with affective disorders in every stage of the design process also, in turn, may give in itself particular ethical concerns. So, does it affect their mental health? So here we would advise also to have additional screening techniques and heightened concerns with participant recruitment. Another theme that was common has to do with secondary use of data. So logging very personal data like symptoms, mood changes, etc. can raise concerns with how this data might be misused later. So there's often a need to anonymize and make sure that the data keeps and stays anonymized and cannot, Also, We have seen concerns with seeking voluntary consent, even when the data that is taken is publicly available, such as, for example, social media posts, since academic research can be seen as an unforeseen and unintended secondary use. Finally, since a lot of the papers were concerned with diagnosing affective disorders, we have also seen interesting discussions on how the diagnosis can impact people, particularly when systems take this authoritative role of claiming a diagnosis. There needs to be a concern on when and where can this diagnosis be shared. How can it affect the personal identities of the users, their professional identities? Does it risk perpetuating stigmas and discrimination against mental illness, for example, if it's revealed within a workplace situation? All in all, we think, with concern to ethics, we think it's the responsibility of the researchers to anticipate and recognize when these technologies can harm people, and to engage actively in addressing these issues. The final question has to do with clinical evaluation. So we asked if the HCI work on affective health has been validated through clinical evaluations, and how. And by clinical evaluations, we mean with clients of a mental health service or people who meet the criteria for a specific mental health problem. We've also sought to see if, we also looked at if the technologies developed were also went through a process of clinical trial for effectiveness. And we can also say that we didn't find any studies in our sample that used a randomized controlled trial for effectiveness. Only 16 out of 139 report having clinical evaluations at all. We know that combining clinical research and technology development is very challenging. It's very different worlds. Developing healthcare interventions is a process that can take multiple years, many stages of progression, from exploratory trials to controlled trials, long-term implementation studies, and so on. We know that technology development is often made on a project-based, much faster publication time. And we also know that there are ethical issues around exposing patients to novel technologies, and there are good reasons there to have also access barriers to clinical settings. So we are not saying that every novel design should go all the way into the clinical settings at all. However, also here we looked a bit closer into these 16 papers and tried to see what can be learned in terms of for HCI. So we have seen that whenever clinical systems go all the way into clinical evaluation, we can say that we can understand we can understand the context much better. So, for example, we've seen our research gives information on how different illnesses affect technology use. For example, bipolar patients may log data differently if they are going through different episodes of their disease. Depressed people may not wish to use the phone. We've also seen how clinical evaluation can give to research in HCI new challenges and design opportunities. So when we see, for example, both patients or clinicians appropriating technologies for ends that were not originally envisioned by the designers. So, for example, patients using mood diaries to address embarrassing topics that could not be embarrassing topics with a psychotherapist. And finally, that HCI research, when tested in clinical settings, can progress for a much more solid evidence base. The inverse is also true. As a community in HCI, we have methods for understanding requirements and context, and study how people interact with technology, and methods for ideation of novel solutions that can result in novel forms of treatment. So we see that there is value, although it is very hard to do in combining these types of research. As a summary, we see that this area is growing very fast, very rapidly, and we are happy for that. But we see three areas for growth, and we are pulling it in different directions here. One is in terms of innovation. We think research in HCI has the potential to support a much wider variety of therapies and develop systems that perform a more varied systems functions. So, for example, as I said, coping mechanisms for everyday life, for managing of affective disorders. We also see that we'd like to see more commitment to ethics and more active ethics discussions as well in research in this area. And we'd like to also see more collaborations between HCI, clinical psychology, psychotherapy, and other relevant disciplines. This can result in more clinical research, but also a wider range of treatments supported by the designs that we do. So now I'll be happy to take your questions, and thank you for your time.
Thank you, Pedro. Just a reminder that we've got the microphones on either side and a roaming mic, so raise your hand if you want the roaming mic to come to you. Do we have any questions? If there's no one ready to ask a question,
Is this a mic? Is this a mic here? Or the front?
Yes,
oh,
yes.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. So,
you, sorry.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the review, and I appreciate you doing this really comprehensive, helpful work. So I've worked on technology for helping people deal with mental health in collaboration with clinical psychologists. And I think one thing I can imagine some clinical psychologists saying is, you made a comment about, all these things, 9% have been done with cognitive behavior therapy. So maybe we should consider a wider range of therapies. So I think one comment they would have would be, well, I think they would ask you, well, are you sure that the best approach is to throw out CBT and try DBT or problem solving or something else or psychoanalysis? Because they would say, well, CBT is the thing that has the most evidence. That's what everyone teaches in clinical psych nowadays. And one thing they might also say is, maybe the issue is not CBT is one thing. CBT is 500 things. And I think there are these things called dismantling studies. What components of a therapy work? So they might say, well, is it that we should get rid of CBT, or is it that what HCI people could help with is figuring out what are the active ingredients of CBT that should be translated, or what form of CBT should be used? So I'm not sure what you'd say to that.
So although I completely agree with the comment that CBT is a very, very solid evidence base, so it's a safe place to start. We've also seen that CBT, clinical psychologists could also say that CBT does not work for all kinds of patients. So for example, there is active commitment therapy, there is CFT, compassion-focused therapy, and so on. We've seen some of this work represented in HCI research, but and also, as I say, we are pulling into different directions. On one side, we want to see more innovations, so we want to go a bit, take risks and go out there. On the other hand, we also want to see thoughtful, ethical discussions and evidence and slow evidence-based research. So I would say that it has been a bit, what we have seen, it's that CBT is just taken because it's a safe, well-validated option. But there are many forms of therapy that show promise for affective disorders in different settings and for different people. And we as a community are not supporting all the others, are just supporting the main one. And so maybe we should be a bit more bold, I think.
There are no questions from the audience. I'd like to ask a question. It's great to see such a thorough and thoughtful literature review, and I'm really impressed with the number of references. You've got over 180 references in your paper, which is very impressive. What I wanted to ask, though, was whether there may have been, whether you've given any thought to focusing on the SIGCHI proceedings, whether that might have excluded some of the work in this space. A lot of this work involves collaboration, as you point out there that we need to leverage that collaboration, and sometimes the work gets published in forums that align with our collaborators' disciplines.
So we have to take a lot of decisions in the beginning, even just focusing on, as there was a talk before about, in a sense, in the beginning, even just focusing on the ACM digital library would already taken a lot of. But we also see that a lot of the research that we publish in HCI tends to be published in conferences as well, and we had to, like I said in the beginning, we had to make a hard decision in terms of what could be feasible or not. And we know that there might be journals that are more interdisciplinary, and we are not catching that kind of research. Yes, that is true.
That was a very nice link to our paper earlier by Ali. Okay, I think there's somebody over there. We're running a little bit over time, but
Yeah, just a quick question, kind of building off of your question, actually. So what do you think is then the right model for how we balance publication between venues like CHI and more clinical venues where our collaborators might be looking to publish their kind of work? You understand?
I don't think there is an answer for that in terms of where to publish. You mean like so you have a collaboration between different disciplines, and where do you choose to publish, or you mean more conferences versus journals?
I just mean in general, if one of the challenges that we're having is that we're not getting clinical trials in venues like CHI, but we as CHI researchers want our work to be recognized, and we want to be working with these clinical collaborators. How might we build out publishing models that then support us in doing these more clinical evaluations that align with the goals of our collaborators?
I don't see any particular reason why we shouldn't be able to publish clinical trials at CHI.
Let me just say something quickly on that point. One thing to answer that is really, is there any reason you can't publish it at CHI and then package it for a journal after? Because often these journals don't even think that CHI is a publication. So that could be something to explore.
I'm going to wrap things up there because we've gone past our time, but that sounds like a great conversation to continue in the break. I believe we have a break now yes, we have a break now, and then the keynote in the Clyde auditorium. Thank you to all four of our speakers.